Welcome to the 2026 Joel and Clifton Lectures. Being a special year for UCL, we decided we would put on 2 talks. So you're exceptionally lucky because normally you only get 1. And the 2 talks are going to be given by, first of all, somebody that was awarded the Clifton Fellowship. And the second talk is going to be given by somebody that's got years of experience of medical imaging. But I think we'll come on to that as part 2. So I'm going to hand you over to Jem, who's going to introduce the Clifton talk, and then I'll stand up and tell you a little bit about the Joel lecture.
It's a pleasure for me to introduce the Clifton lectureship talk today. I'd like to say a few words about John Clifton himself and about the establishment of the fellowship. So John was head of department. Well, he was head of the UCLH medical physics department for a number of years, and he was instrumental in forming this our UCL department when the Middlesex Hospital Medical Physics Department merged with University College Hospital in 1988. So he's really one of the founder, or the founder of our UCL Department of Medical Physics and Biomedical Engineering. Now, John was appointed the Joel Professor in 1990 and retired a couple of years later, just a few months before I joined UCL. However, John stuck around. He visited the department quite regularly, and I got to know him very well. And when I became head of department, I found it particularly valuable to learn more about the history of the department, John's role in it indeed, and other major figures over the years. And he became really a good friend to me, and I would say a really good friend to the department. He cared passionately about the future of the department. One of the first things he did for the department was to establish the John Clifton Prize, where he gave a donation to UCL so we could provide an annual prize to our undergraduates. And he was invited in to present these awards. So I show pictures here from the first 3 awards of the John Clifton Undergraduate Prize. But when he died in 2023, he very kindly made a really quite substantial donation to the department, which was then topped up by his daughter Carolyn to produce really quite a substantial fund with a general direction for the department to help support our young researchers. And that's very much in John's character. He cared passionately about young people and giving them the best opportunities. In fact, a few days ago, I dug out a paper among some documents which Carolyn left me. It's a paper, this is a preprint from Physics Education. It's a paper that was published 54 years ago by John called Careers in Physics Applied to Medicine. And in this brief paper, it's all about how to encourage young people to pursue careers in physics and engineering in the health sciences, and very much key to his general character. And thus, we were honoured to establish this Joel Clifton Fellowship Prize, which enables us to support competitively. We ask our postdocs to apply, and we judge them and choose the best candidate to enable them to spend up to 6 months on a research project of their own design, and hopefully as a means of kicking off their own careers in a particular area. So I'm pleased to be able to present the Clifton Lecture this year by last year's winner, which is Dr. Elizabeth Powell, and here she is being presented her medal by Carolyn a year ago. So, Elizabeth, we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm going to be talking to you today about your blood vessels, specifically how leaky are they and how we can measure that using MRI. So what I want to do is I want to kick off giving you a bit of a background into my research area and then move on to how the Clifton Fellowship kind of fits into that. So I'm a physicist by training, and what I've been doing for the last 6 years as a postdoc is developing new imaging technologies, so specifically MRI, to measure blood-brain barrier permeability, so the integrity of the blood vessels in our brain. And so what I proposed to do with the Clifton Fellowship then was start translating some of these techniques to measure how permeable the placenta is, which brings me on to the more general title of my talk, how leaky are your blood vessels? So why is this something that we even want to look at? Now, vascular permeability is a key component in regulating normal organ function. So if we think about blood vessels in the brain to begin with, the main cells, there we go, there's my mouse. The main blood vessel cells, along with a lot of other cells in the brain, they form the blood-brain barrier. And these essentially protect the brain from any blood-borne toxins. They ensure particular essential nutrients are transferred into the brain tissues. So we have lots of different channels and pathways across the blood-brain barrier. And it also ensures there's metabolic waste clearance. Now, in disease, we get dysfunction to all of these components. And specifically, we get this sort of breakdown of the vessel walls, so we get gaps between the cells. And this means not only that we get a disruption in the regulation of the necessary metabolites, but we also get an infiltration of toxins from the blood into brain tissues. And none of this is good. And neurovascular dysfunction occurs in numerous neurological disorders. So you can see here Alzheimer's disease, multiple sclerosis, stroke, many, many more. And you can see also that they influence a huge number of people. So these numbers are indicative just of people in the UK, not even worldwide. And a key feature is that this dysfunction often occurs before symptoms even appear. So if we had a way to detect this really early low-level damage, this would mean that patients get earlier diagnoses, more precise treatment monitoring, but it also gives us the opportunity as researchers to develop new opportunities and new therapies. The problem we have, though, is that current imaging methods lack the sensitivity to this really early low-level damage. So currently, what's used in the clinic is contrast-enhanced MRI, and this is used clinically for severe damage. And so you can see in the cartoon here, what happens is we have a gadolinium contrast agent. This is injected into the bloodstream, and where we have this breakdown in the blood-brain barrier, the gadolinium leaks across, uptakes into the tissue, and we can see this in our MRI scans as these regions of bright enhancement. So this is an example in tumor, where we've got these damaged vessels around the periphery of that tumor. The problem is, though, that gadolinium is a very large molecule, so these gaps, they need to be quite large, they need to be quite a lot of them to see enough uptake in tissue to get this enhancement on our MRI scans. So it has quite low sensitivity to this low-level damage that we're interested in. And there are also increasing environmental and safety concerns, all of which means they are not suitable for all patient groups. And so instead of using a contrast agent, what I do in my research is I detect early neurovascular dysfunction using water exchange MRI. So using the water molecules that are already in our body as that contrast agent and getting rid of the gadolinium entirely. So this has two benefits. The first is that water is a much smaller molecule than gadolinium. So we have greater sensitivity to this early low-level damage. And so this is an example from an ongoing study that we have. And these are maps of vascular permeability. So the blues and the greens indicate quite low permeability, the reds much higher permeability. And so what our results are suggesting here is an increase in permeability with the MS subtype severity, so higher permeability in more severe MS subtypes. And this is really interesting because this is without any influence of lesions. So we know that there's a lot of local dysfunction where the lesions are. But what we can do with water exchange MRI is we can detect these global changes in what is other normal appearing white matter using water exchange MRI. The second benefit is that there is no exogenous contrast agent, so we don't have these environmental and safety concerns, which means it's suitable for all patient groups. Having said all that, these techniques are still in their infancy, so there's still a lot of developmental work going on, and it also means that so far they have been solely developed and applied to blood vessels in the brain. But if we look at all the benefits of water exchange MRI, so sensitivity to low-level damage, suitability for patient groups, there's a really clear avenue for research in applying these methods into other organs and translating them to patient groups that would be otherwise unsuitable for receiving contrast agents. And so this is where the Clifton Fellowship comes in. And this is what I proposed to do. And this was a collaboration with both King's and Cardiff and Siemens. And what I wanted to do specifically was to quantify permeability in the placenta. Now, the whole purpose of the placenta essentially is to exchange oxygen, nutrients, and waste between mum and baby. Now, we know from ex vivo studies that vascular abnormalities are a key component in a lot of potentially fatal complications, such as fetal growth restriction and preeclampsia. But currently, it's not yet been attempted to quantify placental exchange using MRI. And this is a really exciting avenue. If we could non-invasively assess placental function during pregnancy, this could lead to a really early intervention for some of these really fatal complications. So there were two aspects to what I proposed doing. The first was to develop digital phantoms of the placenta capillary bed, and the second was to acquire some in vivo data, so our first placenta water exchange MRI data. So if we just start with the capillary phantoms to start with. So the goal of what we're doing in water exchange MRI is to try and infer some property from the tissue, our vascular microstructure, so in this case permeability, from our MRI signals. And microstructure is really the operative word here. So our blood vessels are on the order of micrometers, whereas our images are on the order of our resolution is millimeters. So we can't directly measure permeability, and we have to infer that information from our MRI signal. And so to do that, we acquire lots of data with different contrast in all the images, and we look at how the signal behaves in each voxel. And we use a model to try and interpret that behavior. And this signal model is really the key to relating what happens, how our MRI signal is affected not only by how we've acquired the data, but those underlying features that we're really interested in measuring, so the vascular permeability, but also other aspects of the vascular geometry. The problem is the microstructure is inherently very complex, while our MRI signals and our models are necessarily very simple. So how can we accurately infer permeability from our MRI signals? And so just to give you a bit of an idea of the challenge, this is a normal placenta, top left, and then the authors of this paper have then removed all the tissue, so you're left with a cast of just the vasculature. And once you have that cast, they then did a micro-CT image, which you can see bottom right, which has much, much better resolution than our MRI scans. And from there, we're able to do this kind of digital rendering. And from that, you can see really how complex this microstructure is, and how all these different properties of the vessels and the tissue microstructure is going to influence our MRI signals. But there's no way of imaging or getting that data from a living patient. It's just far too complex for our MRI scans. And so we turn to digital phantoms and simulations. And so what I've been doing is developing generative models of the capillary bed. And you can see an example here on the right. And because this is a generative model, it means we can control the microstructure. So we can control the length and the diameter of the vessels, how tortuous they are, the blood velocity through them, and also the permeability. And all of these features then influence our MRI signal. So we also then need to be able to generate our MRI signal from these phantoms. And so water exchange MRI uses the motion of water molecules in the tissue and in the vasculature to encode permeability. So this next thing we needed to do was to simulate the motion of the water molecules. So I think that just about renders. So this is a kind of quite a very pared down example of just how we can model blood flow through the generative phantoms that we develop. And this all builds into how we simulate our MRI signal, essentially. The second aspect that we need to simulate, and the key one really, is permeability. So this is a very simple model just to kind of demonstrate permeability. So what we're looking at here is just a simple sphere which has some permeability associated with its surface. And what we can do in my simulations is initialize all our water molecules inside that sphere, and then, assuming we've got the physics of our system right, track the motion of these molecules and how they exchange across the cell membrane. Let's assume this sphere is a cell for now. And because this is a really simple geometry, this has an analytical solution. And that's what we're looking at on the right. So we're looking at how the number density of these molecules varies over time. And so our solid lines are our analytical solutions, and the dots, which I think you can see, is what we measure from our simulations. So this gives us confidence that we've encoded the physics correctly in our simulations, which is really, really important before we start making any inferences from these more complex vascular geometries. And so this is the simulation framework, essentially, that helps us decode all our in vivo data. We can change all our generative parameters. We can create lots of different microstructures and understand how our MRI signals vary based on these underlying features. And so I've got some interesting results, but I don't really have time to go into them now. So I'll go on to the second part of the project, which is acquiring placenta water exchange MRI in vivo. So this is a new technology. So we're adding new capability to the MRI scanner. So essentially what we need to do is to modify the underlying source code of the scanner with a patch that essentially tells it to do what we want it to do and makes it sensitive to our vascular permeability. But these are hospital scanners, so we can't simply reprogram them as we would like. So we need to do this within a governance framework and ensure that the scanner can still be used clinically. Now, this was much more time-consuming than I had possibly anticipated. And I won't bore you with this slide too much, but there was just a whole host of contracts and different things that needed to happen before we could even get the code on the scanner. But needless to say, now we have the code that we need to modify our scanner, and I'm working now on installing that on the scanner, because obviously the software versions are different, so that's also incompatible. And I can't tell you how much I wish this talk was in a month and I had some actual in vivo data to show you. But having said that, the digital phantom and the simulation framework is all in place, so we can we're able to decode that data as soon as we get it. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today. I think I wanted to finish with a couple of reflections on the impact of the Clifton Fellowship in general. We've heard about the scientific development, so how I've been able to develop new digital capillary bed phantoms, and how I will have in vivo data in about a month's time. But also, the whole purpose of this is to develop the career of the fellow. And so really, I think it's achieved everything that it set out to do, because I've got new collaborations with both KCL and Siemens. I've expanded into a new clinical field in obstetrics and fetal medicine. And I also have now an ongoing collaboration with Sarah Neve Silva, who is now a postdoc at KCL. So she spent her PhD working on fetal imaging, and she's just been awarded an early career fellowship from the British Heart Foundation, part of which is going to be using these water exchange techniques to measure placental exchange in different at-risk groups. And lastly, this is also going to be pilot data for my own career development applications, which I'm writing up to submit in the autumn. And so that's it from me. Huge thank you to my collaborators. This was a joint effort between a lot of different institutes, but also a huge thanks to John Clifton and his family for the generous donation that enabled this fellowship and this work. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.
First, I should say that the person who should really be doing this is Charlotte Hagen, who's done all the work here. She organised the invitations for the applications and the judging and so on. But anyway, I've got the honour of announcing it, and the winner of the 26-27 Clifton Fellowship is Dr. Nam Trung Hun. Yeah. Could I ask Chris and Karen to come up and Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lizzie. That was really interesting. To somebody that works with X-rays, to learn a little bit more about MRI, it was really interesting. Okay, so we move on to the Joel lecture for 2026. And for those of you that have not been present at previous Joel lectures, I thought I ought to say a few words about what the Joel lecture is and how it was established and why we feel it's worth having a Joel lecture every year. For those of you that have been to one before, and I'm sure there's a few in the audience that have, I'm afraid you're going to have to go through the same slide that I've used every year for the last 12 years. And I'm sure some of you could probably give it better than I could, but let me just move on to this slide. Okay, this is what I'm meant to be introducing. Sorry, I'm going to do it in this order first. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Joel lecture first of all. And I think it's really important to appreciate it because the Joel lectureship is the lectureship that's the first established area of academic medical physics in the world. So the department to which most of you now belong is the oldest medical physics department, academic medical physics department in the world. And the Joel chair was established through a route that I'm going to try and explain to you. And if you've only fairly recently joined UCL, some of this might be fairly new to you. Unfortunately, I can't use a pointer because I'm colourblind, so I've got no idea where the pointer is pointing on the screen. So what I'll have to do, and my arms aren't long enough, I'll have to describe to you what goes on. But the top dark blue line represents what was the Middlesex Hospital, which sat over the road from UCLH. And the bottom lighter coloured slide is University College Hospital. In the top is the Middlesex, and the Middlesex was established in 1745, and it was a unique hospital, certainly in London, because it was the first hospital to ever have a ward that was dictated purely by cancer treatments. So these were established in 1792, and the now rather famous statement was made by Stanley Whitbread to say that the patients were either relieved by art or released by death. And fortunately, art has improved over the years, and so that statement is still quite true, unfortunately, but the bit that's really important is that the thing that is successful is certainly partly responsible from activities that have gone on in UCL and the medical school. In 1835, the Middlesex Hospital introduced a medical school, and the interesting fact is, if you look very carefully at what is labelled the University College Hospital, in fact, what actually opened was the North London Hospital Medical School in 1834. And the reason that opened is because the Middlesex, which used to train its doctors from the early stages of the 1700s, refused to accept students from the newly formed UCL that wanted to do medicine into its wards. So UCL decided it would, instead of that, it would make sure that it could teach its students that were interested in medicine by opening the North London Hospital and its medical school. That rapidly changed to become known as University College Hospital because of the association with University College. And you'll notice that this was opened 1 year before the Middlesex, And if you read the minutes of the council of the Middlesex Hospital, there's a very strong exchange about why on earth should we curtail to this new university over the road. We're not interested. We can carry on teaching all of our own doctors. But they then realised that if they took that stance, they would never have any other medical students because they'd all go to UCL, in which case they opened up their medical school to make sure they could attract them to the Middlesex. The story carries on, and in between, in the late 1800s, obviously, as we all know, is the discovery of X-rays and radioactive materials. But these two gentlemen, whose pictures I show you here, were born around about the 1850s, and they were two men who were, two brothers, who were born in the East End of London into not a poor background, a relatively okay background, but the way in which they earned a living was to entertain people. So they would often go to Wilton's. I'm not sure if anybody here has been to Wilton's at the East End of London, which is still a music hall that operates still. They would entertain people, and then they realised that there was an awful lot of activity going on in South Africa finding diamonds. And they thought they would go out there and entertain the people that were mining diamonds. So they go out there, and 17 years later, they had made enough money by setting up their own diamond facility that they sold out to De Beers for what was £5 million. And in those days, that was an awful lot of money. They then went on to gold mining, horse racing, Bentley racing, various other activities, making lots of money. Harry died, and he left a lot of money to the Middlesex Hospital Medical School in order to establish 3 chairs that would be suitable for advancing the treatment of cancer. Because of the reputation of the Middlesex at this stage, it was one of the best known treatment centres for cancer in London. They decided that they would leave this money to the Middlesex to establish 3 chairs. So in 1912, this amount of money was available to the medical school to establish these 3 chairs. One was in surgery, one was in chemistry, which became biochemistry, and one was in physics applied to medicine. Specifically chosen not to be medical physics, because in those days, medical physics meant just radiation, and they wanted to cover a wider range of activities, so biophysics and these sorts of activities. And it was established at that stage, and then in 1920, the first recipient was put in place, and that was Sidney Russ, who was the hospital physicist in Middlesex. So he was the first academic appointment to a chair in a subject area related to the application of physics to medicine. And that's carried on, and then in 1988, there was a merger, as you know. The University of London, at that point, many of the colleges were still governed through the Federal University of London, and degrees could only be awarded through the University of London. But in 1988, Middlesex Medical School joined with University College Hospital Medical School, and then both those medical schools merged with UCL. And so that's the reason the Joel Chair is now celebrated in UCL, because of this association and this merging that took place. Well, I think you've heard enough about that. So let me introduce you to what's really the point of me telling you about the Joel Chair, that we have these lectures once a year, and it gives me a really great pleasure to introduce Dave Hawkes this year. And it's a fairly unique aspect for myself, because there are 2 aspects that are completely new to me. I've never, ever, in my career, and I've been in this field for a fair number of years, I've never ever introduced somebody that has an institute named after them, number 1. And number 2, I've never had the opportunity to introduce a rock legend. Now, I think we might learn a little bit more about that as time goes on, and at least I'm hoping we're going to learn a little bit more about that as time goes on. But Dave, I mean, I don't think he really needs a lot of introduction. He's worked in medical applications, particularly in imaging, and adding a computer to imaging. Because certainly when Dave and I first knew each other, most people were interested in just producing a nice image. Not many people were interested in actually taking that image and applying a computer program to it to get more information from that image. And Dave has built a reputation in that area and in other areas. So it gives me great pleasure, Dave, to welcome you to give the 2026 Joel Lecture. And thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here. Good afternoon, or is it now good evening? And it's great to see you and to also see a lot of familiar faces, some of whom I haven't seen for 3 or 4 years. Actually, first thing I've got to do, because everybody says I rabbit on for far too long, and so look, I've got a stopwatch here to tell me to shut up when it's time for some drinks. So my job now is to tell you how I went from being this rock star, you've got to sort of decide which one of those is me, through to sailing in the rain, bar lots and lots of doing things with images, and I'll explain that slide later on. But what I want to do in this talk is also to pay tribute to a number of people who I've had the good fortune to have them advise me when I was very young, as you'll see in the first slide, but also further on in my career, and to whom I am very grateful. First is my grandfather. So this is Norman Davey here. That's actually me, looking very puzzled by what he's trying to show me. He was a civil engineer at the Building Research Station, so he was an engineer, but he was also an archaeologist and became quite a renowned archaeologist in his later years, and worked with Mortimer Wheeler. And so that's probably my first connection with UCL, because Mortimer Wheeler, as you know, was over at the Institute of Archaeology just around the corner. And he explained to me in some detail the difference between invention and discovery. And he was probably doing that at the time, which is why I was so puzzled. So he was interested in Roman plaster, and in particular, having a pile of rubble in some of these excavation sites, how you would put those together. And he invented a way of, when the wall fell over, how you could lay plaster of Paris and chicken wire, pick them up, so that they would reveal patterns like this. And so this is one of the ones that he restored from Verulamium. And I checked down in the British Museum a couple of days ago, and it's still there, so go and have a look. It was fantastic work that he did, but I was grateful for his advice. Then, carrying on a few more years, went through physics at Oxford, and then finished up in Birmingham, where I worked on the Nuffield cyclotron, published my first paper, and boom, it got 9 citations. I was so proud of that, hey! But what it probably meant, it was probably a totally useless piece of work that had almost zero impact. But I did meet this character. So he's the last author on this paper, John Fremlin. And his hobby was to take stereo pictures of wildflowers, and he was collecting these pictures. It was quite a exhaustive catalogue he produced with this wonderful stereo camera here that he'd restored. And that actually, I think later on, I sort of relied on some of the stuff that he was telling us in sort of dinners that we'd have round at his place about how we perceive stereo and build up 3D pictures in our head. I then, having finished my master's up in Birmingham, had to think, well, I need to earn some money. So I went back to Southampton, near where I used to live, and joined the NHS. It wasn't really what my career plan was, but this was the first time I started getting involved in medical imaging, in nuclear medicine. It's also where I first learned, by having experience of working at the coalface of the NHS, how much somebody with an engineering or a physical sciences background could contribute by solving some problems that were really unsolved. And I think that was very important. But it also enabled me to do this. So there I was, a rock star in the band. We were the best band between Bournemouth and Brighton on the south coast. Sadly, all things come to an end. I think my career is a bit like Brian May's in reverse. You know, Brian May, he's the guitarist for Queen. He famously gave up a PhD at Imperial in order to become a rock star. I famously gave up this career as a musician in order to return to medical physics. So, I say all things come to an end, and I finished up with this with a desire to go into academia and to do research. And so there was a PhD going at Surrey University in Guildford, and this was jointly with the Royal Marsden, and it was playing with the world's first whole body CT scanner. There was two of them, one in Manchester and one in the Royal Marsden. And I think it was referred to in the previous talk about the difficulty of going in and altering a clinical machine. It wasn't in those days. So when was I? This was about 1978. So they had their brand new shiny whole body CT scanner, and I went in at about 7 o'clock in the evening with my toolkit out of the back of my car, and I took it to bits. It was great fun taking it to the bits and finding out how it worked. And I was changing things, like changing the X-ray filters to sort of change the signal that we got in the images that were produced. And as long as I delivered it back to them at 8 o'clock the next morning in working order, nobody seemed to mind. One day that didn't. I got a phone call. I was fast asleep, having stayed up all night. And they said, the machine doesn't work, CT scanning doesn't work. And so I had to get out of bed and go back in to find out what was on. It wasn't my fault. It had developed another fault, nothing to do with me messing around with it. But I think that rather curtailed what I was doing. Anyway, in that time, the second of my people who I owe a lot to is the wonderful Daphne Jackson. I was so pleased to have her, or so proud to have her as my supervisor. She was a domitable lady. She was a theoretical physicist of some repute, and I think this was also the first contact I probably had with Rob Speller, who was at that time working with David White. I'm not sure if this story is quite true, but she was thinking that a lot of medical physics is a bit ad hoc and pragmatic and lacking in rigor, and she felt that medical physics needed to have more rigor, and she had an argument with David White, I believe, at a conference about that. David White, I think, was probably right, as was Rob, but she had a point. And what I wanted to do with her was to develop a much more accurate parameterization of the X-ray attenuation coefficient for something called dual energy CT. The other two things I'd like to mention about her, she was appalled. She was the first female professor of physics in the country and the first female head of department of a physics department in the country, which is in the early 1970s, which is, that says something, doesn't it? She set up, in her memory, was set up the Daphne Jackson Foundation to provide funds for women who were not staying on in the profession because of childcare responsibilities to come back into the profession. And I helped them out a few times in recent years. She was also, she pushed things through and made things happen, and she was instrumental in setting up the first breast screening program in the UK. Sadly, while she was supervising me, she was diagnosed with breast cancer and succumbed a few years, which was sort of rather ironic and very sad. But I owe a lot to her, the rigor that she applied to judging what I was doing during a PhD. And so I produced this parameterization of the X-ray attenuation coefficient, and I got to know a little bit about the areas that she was publishing. This is great, physics reports, this paper. Look at that, 169 to 233. I can't do the sums now, what's that? 64 pages. That's half my PhD went into one paper, pretty well verbatim. It's great, isn't it? So much easier than these days. Anyway, it was pages and pages of this sort of thing. And this was the result. This is the formula for the X-ray attenuation coefficient. And I just love this statement. Or, using the simpler expression, it becomes that. Anyway, the story about the citations was interesting. It got a handful of citations over the next 20 years. Nobody took it terribly seriously. But then in the year 2000, things changed. And Siemens came up with a dual energy CT scanner. This was 20 years after we did this work, which the precision of which was sufficient to get down to the quantum limited signal. And then it did matter that you got the formulation right. And so people started referring to it. So over the next 20 or so years, we got 800 citations on that. So sometimes things take a long time to have impact, I think was the message from that. Then that was 1981, finished my PhD. And for those of you who were around at that time, there might be a few in the audience here, Thatcher had just cut back science funding by a dramatic amount. And so I was looking for my postdoc. There were no postdoc positions available in the UK. Most of my compatriots went abroad or just left the field completely. I turned around, did what I was doing before, and went back to nuclear medicine, this time at St George's Hospital down in Tooting. But I was fortunate to have contact with at least two of these three gentlemen. I was working for John Perry. He was the physicist who was on the original CT scan publication back in 1971, I think it was. That was the original CT scan that was produced on that scanner. Jamie Ambrose was a neuroradiologist at Atkinson Morley Hospital. I never actually met this gentleman at that time, but I'll come back to that later. But I had an interesting 7 years, and I could have stayed in hospital medicine, in hospital medical physics. And there was a route for me to go up in the management structure. But in 1988, and Liz, my dear wife, will remember this, I decided I was going to go back into academia after all. And I took up a post at Guy's Hospital. So this is a picture of Guy's Hospital as it was then. And if you go up to the top here and look out of there, you had the best view in London, because it's the only place in London that you couldn't at that time see Guy's Hospital. It's such an ugly building. It's now got the Shard just there, so it sort of rather hides it. That was interesting. Got involved in various organisations like ITMI, Information Processing and Medical Imaging. And I had to show this slide because I think there's one or two people in the audience. Simon, where have you gone? You were here. I found you just now. And I can't, oh, there you are. Look, there's Simon Arridge. Simon, put your hand up, there he is. And there's one or two other people you might recognise. I don't think Lewis Griffin is here, but he was in this picture. But I did team up with this character, Alan Colchester, and we worked together for many years, developing various aspects of looking at blood flow in the brain, while first of all at George's and then moving on to Guy's. When I moved to Guy's, and this is an interesting story, part of the career history, I thought I had a long-term contract. When I arrived, they said, oh, you know that grant that was going to pay for your salary? Sadly, it didn't come through. But we have got 3 months of your salary in the kitty. So there I was, 2 small children, supporting a family on 3 months' salary. I thought, oh, shit. Sorry, excuse the language. Fortunately, I was sitting next to this gentleman. We didn't even have a lab at Guy's Hospital. We had a corridor at the back of the X-ray department which had 2 desks in it. And he was sitting in the other desk. And he's a lovely guy, Ray Gosling. He's famous for having produced the famous Photo 51 with Rosalind Franklin. And most of you will recognize this as the X-ray crystallograph of DNA. And it confirms the double helix structure. But while I was sitting worrying about my future, he was. We used to enjoy beers after work at the Market Porter in Burham Market. Every academic must nurture that big idea that could win them a Nobel Prize. So, right, I was there with ambition and see what happens. Fortunately, a Leverhulme Trust grant went in and it did get funded, and I wasn't left destitute, and I managed to continue my career. And I think it was after I arrived at Guy's, I thought, well, it's this triangle that seems to be important, and from my observation of what was going on in healthcare, to really make new ideas work and new ideas translate into clinical practice. You had to be able to have, well, that was us, the academic imaging groups, and then we had the healthcare providers, the hospitals primarily, and then it was important that we worked with industry. And another person I want to pay tribute to is this gentleman, Franz Gerritsen. We had a sort of link with Philips Medical Systems at that time, and he was the head of image processing at Philips Medical. And got to know him quite well, and he decided to fund us. He was an interesting character. He would not suffer fools gladly. He was quite forthright in his opinion. If he was going to fund you, and he did fund us, he was absolutely determined to get his pound of flesh for the money that he was giving to us. But he was a great person to work with. And we worked with him on, so I should have done a little warning of this. It's medical physics, so this is all right. There's a bit of a gory picture here. So we were working with him on an early image-guided surgery system produced by Philips, and we did some of the technical work behind it. And here we have a surgical pointer which has these LEDs attached to light-emitting diodes, so it could be tracked, and the position within the tip could be localized and registered to the corresponding point in an image, so that it could be guided through, and this was guided through completely blind, to get to an aneurysm and clip an aneurysm through the back of the oral cavity. And this could not have been done without image guidance. That was the EasyGuide system. And actually, this was done by Alan Crockard, and we worked with him and David Thomas just around the corner at Queen Square for several years, which was very rewarding. But this, we showed it worked. We did the initial validation to get it into clinical practice. It all looked good, but then things happen. Philips changed their priority. They decided they weren't going to fund anything in image guidance anymore, and so they just axed the project. So we were so close to actually having something that could be put out there, and it didn't happen. In the meantime, back at base, we were involved in some more fundamental work on image registration. And this is the picture that is in the, on the title of the talk. And along with Derek Hill. Derek, are you here? He said he might turn up, and he hasn't, has he? So Derek Hill, Colin Studholme. Derek Hill was my first PhD student at Guy's, and Colin Studholme, who was the second one. We were thinking of ways that we could automate registration. Registration of images was important as a means to an end. We had these images coming in from different modalities. We wanted to combine the information, and if we were going to do that within a clinical system, we had to make it automatic. We had various false starts, but then just thinking about this, we thought, well, if you look at a CT scan and a corresponding MR scan, they look kind of similar, although the contrast is different. Maybe there's some relation statistically between the intensities of this image and the intensities of that image. So I thought, let's plot on a graph a histogram or joint probability distribution, taking all the pixels and putting all the voxels and putting them into that plot. And then what happens if we misregister? And we saw that this pattern started to diffuse slightly. And then we thought, well, what we want is a measure of that diffusion. So we came up with joint entropy of this distribution as being perhaps a measure of registration. And then what happened next was an interesting lesson, if you like, in collaboration and openness of communication, and then race to get to a solution. We presented, or actually Derek Hill presented this at a conference in the States in 1994, and there's two people in that audience. There's André Collignon from Leuven, and there was Sandy Wells from MIT in Boston. And they looked at this and they were fascinated by our results, but they said they've got the wrong measure. What they need to do is have the normalized version of the joint entropy. And so they both went away separately. They hadn't talked to each other, they'd just seen our slide. And they beavered away to produce a registration algorithm, and that was very robust and very accurate. And they both published it within a month of each other. Both referred back to our work, so we have some credit for taking them down that route, but we didn't actually get the if you like, the gold medal at the end for getting the final result, but we were part of the story, and they overtook us. But with this, we were able to then produce these were volume renderings done by Cliff Ruff when he was working with us, showing how we can combine these three different modalities in order to get a fused image showing a tumor here, blood vessels from a separate MR sequence, and bone from CT. And actually, not only were these separate images, they were required at separate hospitals and then transferred to one place to be brought together. Then on the success of this, we were starting to begin to get some grant funding in, and we were very fortunate to have Daniel Ruckert, who'd just come out of a PhD at Imperial, join us as a postdoc. And like all good postdocs, lesson to any postdocs in the audience, he didn't do what he was asked to do or what was written on the grant application. He did what he thought was a really good idea. And he was right. So he was meant to be looking at the mathematics of mutual information, trying to improve it. And what he actually did is he took a result of his PhD, which was studying B-spline deformation models. How could that be fused with the mutual information registration measures that we just collected? And we were talking at that time to Martin Leach, who was the physicist down at the Institute of Cancer Research, the Royal Marsden, and he had a set of MR images that he wanted to register. These were MR images of ladies with suspected breast cancer, and it was the images of their breasts, and they were taken before and after contrast material was administered. And when this just shows the 3D rendering of that rotating, and you can see there are, after subtraction of those two images, significant subtraction artifacts. But when we applied the registration algorithm, lo and behold, they're all cleaned up, and you can see very clearly the enhancing lesion here, and also two other suspected lesions whizzing around there. Daniel Ruckert says, if you show that video one more time, it's going to wear out. I'm sure many of you have seen this, but I'm still very proud of that, of those sets of images. And this proved to be something that had profound impact, I think, worldwide in the field of medical imaging. It took us a while to get it published because people were saying, well, actually, it's not that original. We know about B-spline deformation models. We know about mutual information. All you did was glue them together. Yes, we glued them together. We showed that it worked, and we were able to do the validation. And most importantly, what Daniel Ruckert persuaded me to do, and I didn't want this to happen, is he said, this software, you've got to make it available for everybody else to use. Open source it. Put it up on what was then the quite early stages of the World Wide Web, and let people copy it and play with it. And that was exactly the right thing to do. So because it worked, and other people downloaded it and used it in their application, and it worked, it got an enormous number of citations and had a big impact. And even though we put it in the public domain, it still was commercialized because the companies were picking it up as well and putting it into their workstations. And I think the benefit to us as a group, because we became then quite well known and were able to get more grant funding in and more industrial funding, I think that was more than compensated for the fact that we'd let the cat out of the bag by making everything public. At the same time, we were still doing the image-guided surgery, and Eddie Edwards, Philip Edwards, who again I was hoping to be in the audience, but I think he's, Danny Alexander will know this, I think he's very busy marking, isn't he? And he wasn't allowed out to come to this conference. So he was a software engineer who joined us about a couple of years before this, and when you think of that gruesome image with the pointer, it was indirect, looking at the screen and seeing the patient. So the surgeon wanted to somehow bring those together. And so we were looking at ways that we could inject into a surgical operating microscope that's used in many of these tricky procedures in the base of the skull. And we worked with Leica. It's a little bit like that stereo camera I showed in one of the first slides. So we calibrated the optics of the surgical microscope with the help of Leica. We injected with a little projector into each of the the left and the right optical path. And we were able to then produce, can I make this work? This sort of display. And this shows it's actually in 3D, but I can't show 3D here. This is just through one view, showing the outline of the tumor from MRI superimposed on the image, guiding the surgeon precisely where to cut. The tumor has already been removed here, and the surgeon is just placing this pointer into the internal auditory meatus in order to show the location of the tumor there in the right place. And it's right about this time that this guy reappeared, Godfrey Hounsfield. So I promised to be able to say something more about him. We were working on this, and we heard that Godfrey Hounsfield, who still had a research lab going at EMI, or the old EMI labs in the west of London, and we went to see him. And again, part of the issues of translation of technology into medicine. So a group of us went to visit him in his lab, and he proudly showed us this letter that he'd kept from when he first invented CT scanning to the head of medical engineering in Siemens, and the head of medical engineering in Siemens had said something to the tune of, we thank you, Dr. Hansfield, for your interesting invention on X-ray CT. Unfortunately, we cannot see any possible application of that in medicine. We wish you all the best in your endeavors. And he's framed it, he's kept it on his wall. Siemens didn't get the original patent for it. Anyway, he got interested in that, and we got to know him quite well. He was a lovely guy. There may be people in the audience who knew him. He was quite shy and withdrawn, but very interesting to talk to. And we used to invite him to come along to our seminars. So we'd be sitting in the seminar, sometimes in a darkened room, and we just noticed, oh, the door's just opened, and somebody snuck in at the back. And it would be Godfrey had come in to listen to our talks, but he didn't want to make a fuss about him being there. Right, then, coming along, how am I doing with time? Probably badly. I think I'm doing all right, actually. Move to UCL. We were attracted by that lovely, shiny new hospital that you have. Oh, it looked lovely. And also the rather grand building. I should have superimposed it with the current. I've just been through the quad. Doesn't it look lovely now? It's so nice for happy birthday UCL. It's great. This was, well, it's fairly tatty then, isn't it? But it's not too bad. Anyway, we enjoyed joining up with CMIC, and in particular with Danny Alexander, who's somewhere in the audience, and with Simon Irish, who's also in the audience. And we created CMIC, jointly between medical physics and computer science. And off we went, and it was a great success. We had over 100 people by the time we got to 2015. That was 2005 that we moved. So I still have this little triangle. I like this triangle, but now it's got a bit bigger because UCL had all UCL partners, which is all the different hospitals and healthcare institutions that are linked to UCL, and that made it a very powerful place, an interesting place to work. We also, unlike my initial forays in taking CT scanners to bits, we realized that if we were going to get our technology translated, we had to take more notice of the regulatory environment and start building up expertise in getting our technology through regulatory compliance and into first in man and into clinical trials. The other thing is, when I was working at Guy's, if you looked at that skull-base work, even if it had worked and we got it all translated and it was available, it wouldn't have benefited so many patients. Skull-based tumours are relatively rare. I was still interested in seeing what we could do with cancer, and I thought, well, let's try and aim a bit higher and let's tackle the big cancers. So these are the 4 cancers in terms of both the incidence and also the number of deaths. And they dominate the other cancers. These are recent figures from CRUK, but the figures were the same back in 2000, or very similar in 2005. So I started up projects in each of those areas to see how we could bring engineering solutions to bear to improve the lot of the patients who suffer from these diseases. Most of CMIC was involved with neuro work, but we had some extremely good neuroscientists and people working in neuroimaging. And so I kind of left them to get on with it and thought that I would tackle the cancer areas. And we were fortunate in the early days of arriving at UCL to meet up with this gentleman, Mark Emberton, who many of you know. And he was starting to work with the radiologists and the imaging people to improve the lot for men suffering from prostate cancer. It's a very common disease. And he was firmly of the opinion that we're not looking after these men well enough. In particular, there's a problem of overdiagnosis and overtreatment. And with improvements in the technology, can we improve the diagnosis of the cancer in the first place, but also reduce the harm to the men who then go on to have procedures done to them. There's some other people here. So there's Dean Barrett, who was the lead in CMIC, who was working in this area, and Yipeng Hu as well, who was at that time his PhD student. When we started working with them, they were already doing what's called multiparametric MRI. I think there was a mention of that in the last talk. So if you have multiple sequences of MRI, you can bring those together to get more information. And with prostate cancer, you would have T2-weighted imaging, diffusion-weighted imaging, and imaging which has contrast enhancement. So it'd be 3 different MRIs. And Hash Ahmed, who was shown on the previous slide, published a seminal paper resulting of the PROMISE trial looking at MRI to improve the patient pathway for men with suspected prostate cancer. And this paper, and similar papers produced elsewhere, had a major impact on the management of prostate cancer. So they showed on nearly 600 men, 40% of whom had clinically significant disease, that the MRI was 93, the multiparametric MRI was 93% sensitive compared with conventional transrectal ultrasound-guided biopsy, which is only 48%. That's a big difference. And so as a result of that paper and papers like it, the management of men has changed. Most men who have suspected prostate cancer will now have an MRI done before they have the biopsy, and that improves the diagnosis, the accuracy of the diagnosis significantly. But keeping up with that theme of having image guidance, having diagnosed in some men a lesion, and if the lesion's at the right place and of the right size, i.e. not too big, then going in and ablating that lesion with focal, with some energy source. It might be laser light at the end of a needle, it might be cooling, so cryogenic therapy, it may be electrocution, or it may be high-intensity focused ultrasound. So there's a number of different technologies, but they had to be focused. This rather undignified-looking picture here shows what happens to us men. So here we have transrectal ultrasound. There's a needle going into the prostate. You want to guide the needle precisely to where the ultrasound says the lesion, the ultrasound plus the MRI says the lesion is. You've got MRIs that are acquired a day or two beforehand. This might show a lesion here, and there's the outline of the prostate. This is the ultrasound from the rectum shining up to show the outline of the ultrasound, and the task was to map these images onto this deforming structure here. And that's what's shown graphically in that slide there. So this was Yipeng Hu's PhD project and subsequent postdoc work, and he really did a fantastic job on that. So he was building a shape model based on deforming the prostate in a computer simulation many times and building up the statistics of how that prostate might deform. So we do that hundreds of times on one prostate and then produce the so-called statistical shape model, which could be registered back to the ultrasound. And with that, was able to show a registration accuracy, a localization accuracy of about 2.4 millimeters, which is good enough for clinical practice. What he then went on to do and say, well, if you're doing this on hundreds of patients, and there's hundreds of patients going through just the UCH practice, you could build up a population-based statistical shape model. And then when another patient comes along, here, you've got this previously acquired population model. You can apply that to the particular case here, and you have almost identical registration accuracy. And so that thought, that looks good. So Dean Barrett and Yipeng Hu and others set up Smart Target as a company that might commercialize this. And this went to clinical trial, and the clinical trial showed that this computer guidance system was performing as well as as highly skilled urologists who are well trained in all the technology, i.e. the urologists here at UCH. And that's actually an important finding because it means you can somehow democratise this technique so you could go out to hospitals where you perhaps didn't have the skill of the urologist, and you wouldn't actually reduce the accuracy of the technique. Anyway, Smart Target was formed, but I have to say, it did struggle, and it was hard for that company to thrive. And eventually it was sold to a group of urologists in Florida. But I believe it is now doing quite well. But at least we did get it out there and into clinical practice. And the work has continued in MRI. As you've probably seen in the news, this is not our work. This is the work that goes on in radiology and in urology. They're trying to introduce MRI as a screening technique. Prostate cancer, unlike breast cancer, does not have a good screening method. PSA is not sufficiently specific as a screening tool, the analysis of PSA in the blood. And MRI is too expensive. So let's make MRI cheaper. One way of doing that is removing one of the sequences, so that reduced the cost by at least a third, maybe a half. And this study, which was published last year, so coming right up to date, showed that once you reduce from there to there, you actually still detect the same number of cancers. And so we can therefore make the imaging cheaper. We still got work to do. You've probably read in the press that the NICE has just turned down the idea that we should have screening of men based on this technology, or based on similar technology. So NICE, National Institute of Clinical Excellence, I'm sure you all know, but in case you don't, they're the people who pronounce whether or not a particular bit of technology or a drug is going to be introduced into the NHS. But we're working on it, and it will happen one day, and we will get a screening out of this at some stage in the future. And, oh yes, pleased to say, this won the Hawkes Prize in 2025. So it was a pleasure to come here in February. I think it was February, wasn't it? And be able to hand out that prize. And then carry on to the present time. There's lots of work going on, led by Yipeng Hu, who's now an academic in the Hawkes Institute. I won't go through all of this, but it's applying AI to all the different steps to improve the accuracy and robustness of the methodology. It's a gradual process and it takes time, but hopefully we'll see those coming in, which will really transform and speed up the way that these patients are investigated. One more application I think I've got time for. So this is Matt Clarkson. Matt, raise a hand. This is Matt here. I'll embarrass you. Again, I think it was about the time I started at the CMIC I came over from Guy's to form CMIC. We got talking to Brian Davison, who's a surgeon up at the Royal Free. And this project is led by Matt Clarkson and Brian Davison. Problem is liver surgery. And here's some stats. So the liver metastases come from bowel cancer, and that leads to bowel cancer having the second highest cause of cancer death in the UK. For the majority of patients, resection is the only possible cure. Now that might change. There are therapeutic regimes being developed that might change that, drugs that we can take or immunotherapy that can be undertaken, but it's not there yet as far as I know. And liver surgery to remove metastases is a nasty operation. It's a massive cut of the patient's abdomen. It takes months to recover from that. There's a lot of pain and morbidity associated with the surgery. It's not much fun. It would be much better if you could go less invasive with what's called laparoscopic resection. So with a endoscope goes into the abdomen, which is insufflated with gas, so you can look around and then do the surgery. And this shows one of the views. There was a movie, I think. Does that movie work? So this is what it looks like. So that's actually an ultrasound probe that's been stroked along the liver, and that's the view that the surgeon sees inside. So quite a restricted field of view. Anyway, to cut a long story short, over many years, and this was hard work, Matt put together an image guidance system Similar in concept to that early one I showed with the light-emitting diodes, but it's got reflecting spheres instead on the instrument. So a lot of calibration, tracking with a camera system here, so that we can know where the tip of the instrument is in relation to the, once you've done a registration, in relation to the preoperative, in this case, CT scan. So these are the CT scans and how they're formed into a 3D model. This is a view, and it's aligning these two together. And this is quite an old slide now, but it shows the concept, I think, quite well. So what we want to be able to do, rather like that augmented reality that we saw in the skull, is to be able to, come back, show where the blood vessels are to aid resection, and how we can line that up with, so there's the tumor from the model, and how we can line all that up with the intraoperative scene. Whoops, and too many, I'm suffering from user interface or something. So there we are, and there's another example there. Now this has gone into clinic, and there is a short clinical trial, I think Matt will correct me if I get this wrong, that has been undertaken and published. It's proving really hard work to get to the next stage, to get a really fully, what's the word? Having a clinical trial with the large numbers and in different institutions. It requires a lot of resource, but money is being asked for at the moment to enable that to happen. But it takes time. When you look at these times, so this is. These papers were published about 6 years ago. The project started, 6 years? No, even 10 years, I think, before that. And we're now 2026. So it's a long process, this. And it's all part of this translational, the way we do clinical translation, from basic research up to clinical translation. And it was clear that what we needed to do was, in particular, to address this middle bit, the so-called translational gap. And it's where Medical Research Council or even EPSRC say, this is too clinical for us. It's not something that industry can fund. And industry is saying, oh, it's far too risky. We can't possibly invest in this. And so the original Weiss Centre, now the Hawkes Institute, was set up to try and fill this gap and to enable some of this technology to get through. And we're making some progress, I think. In the year that I looked after the Weiss Centre, that's 2018-19, if I remember rightly, we had 3 companies that were sort of set up at the time. Smart Target I've talked about. Odin Vision was a great success. That's an AI-based interpretation of colonoscopy, which was developed in the lab and then spun out and now has been bought out by Olympus. For what seemed to me a very large amount of money. So some people did quite well on that. And then there's EchoPoint, which was a intra-arterial ultrasound-based system for looking at the heart. And I think in terms of entrepreneurship, I am proud of the number of different companies that I've had some contact with in terms of building up these companies and getting this technology translated. So that's probably my latest. So Be Certain, Yungpeng He, who is somewhere in the audience over there. He's actually based over at King's in the dental school there. And it's an AI-based method for interpretation of dental x-rays. And he's told me I'm allowed to say this. It's just completed yesterday, day before yesterday, getting his first round of funding. So round of applause for Yungpeng. But then there's all these other ones that I've had some input into. But I just want to say a little bit about Vision RT. So this is really the last thing I want to go through before wrapping up. And I think it tells an interesting story. Back in the Guy's days, we were working with Norman Smith and Ivan Meir, who at that time were part of another small company called Tricorder. And Tricorder had a vision-based system for reconstructing where, in 3D, where things like surgical instruments might be. And we thought, well, that sounds like a jolly good idea. And we set up a collaboration with them. Tricorder was also looking at lots of other applications of their technology. And as happens with many companies, they overstretched, overspent, and went bust. So our project with them sort of came ground to a very rapid halt. Norman and Ivan then said, well, what are we going to do? We know a bit about this technology and we think it might have some benefit. What can we do? And David Landau is a radiotherapist at Guy's and St Thomas's, myself, these two, and I think some other people from the lab all got together and had a bit of a brainstorm. And David Landau said, why not use it in radiotherapy? Can you not use this localizing, this positioning equipment to improve radiotherapy? So we said, oh yeah, okay, we'll give it a go. Our input was tiny. We just did some measurements on their technology to find out how accurate it was. We got a mannequin, if I remember, it was from one of the shops on Oxford Street, and we just found out how accurately we could place a head. And it was sufficiently accurate for radiotherapy applications. A prototype was put together. It was put into into St Thomas's Hospital. It was put into the Royal Marsden Hospital in Fulham Road. And we dutifully then produced a couple of papers or abstracts that were presented at clinical meetings, but not much happened. And it looked as though, at that time, Norman Smith was, the company that he'd set up to sell this was in his mum's attic. And it was really small scale stuff. And it looked as though they were just going to run out of money and give up again and have to go off and do something else. But they met up with a chap called George Chen, who was the chief radiotherapy physicist at Massachusetts General Hospital over in Boston, at a conference, and he said, oh, this is interesting. Can you install this into my hospital, please? And they said, sure. If you do, I will, and I like it, I will produce a paper at the next big conference. And he duly did that. He got up on the podium and he was there's an opinion maker, somebody that people would listen to. And he said, this tiny company over in London, Vision RT, has produced this bit of technology and it's the bee's knees. You all need to have it, or you all must have it. And they all duly queued up at Norman Smith to buy this technology. And so it suddenly became successful. They had almost gone belly up. They were on their last few, I believe, hundreds of pounds in the bank before they had to sort of say no. And he was very careful about expanding the company. He didn't expand too quickly. He didn't fall over in that expansion. He was very careful with his customers to make sure they're all happy, so the systems were properly supported. And he built up and up and up over the next few years. And it was quite remarkable to see how this happened. He didn't sell up to the big the big radiotherapy companies, though he was tempted. But eventually, in 2018, a Danish medtech investment company bought them out and kept him, kept Vision RT, I believe kept Ivan Mayer, and have now 2022, 2,000 systems, 2025, 3,000 systems. Matt Clarkson and I went to visit him a couple of months back. They're still based up in North London. And the problem they've got is they've saturated the market. They've sold one of these devices to almost every radiotherapy department in the world, and they can't expand anymore. And so they're now looking for other ideas of how to use their technology. So that's a success story. There's not many other, but it's hard work to doing this translation, but a few of them, I think, do succeed. So here we are. And now, over time, just who's chairing this? Nobody's chairing it. I could wrap it on for ages, can't I? I've just got one more thing to say. So there's somebody missing, or a group of people missing from my favorite slide. I won't ask you to say who it is, because I'm going to tell you. Patients. And I think in my latter few years, it's giving the patients a voice in how this technology is developed, I think is so important. And that comes from my own experience. In 2015, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. I mean, if I said, and I won't because it's just embarrassing, for all those men in the audience over, well, of my age or maybe 10 years younger, how many have had prostate cancer? We see quite a show of hands, but I'm not going to say that. Anyway, I got prostate cancer. The GP referred me to Mark Emberton's lot. So I turned from being a sort of, what do you call me, a sort of research scientist in this area to somebody who was hopefully going to benefit from the technology. My lesion was correct, right size and location to have focal ablation. I had cryoablation using the technology that Yipeng Hu and Dean Barrett had developed. I then started talking to Prostate Cancer UK, saying, well, can I sort of help in their publicity? And they put me in touch with this journalist. And so I got a whole page in the Daily Mail. Hey! But as somebody, actually it was Mark who said, don't put this into the Guardian. You want to put something like this into the Daily Mail because you'll have much more impact in the Daily Mail. And he's probably right. So this was produced, and then it was interesting for me too, because I thought what I'm going to do is look back at the patient consent forms. We're all, for those of us who do any clinical translation, we all know about patient information sheets or patient consent forms. I had already signed off on the ones that we were using for some of the prostate work we're doing. I looked back at it after I'd been through the mill myself, and I thought, that was a load of rubbish that we put down there. It wasn't helpful at all. And I rewrote the patient information sheets, or at least part of them, because you have a different point of view when you're a patient, and there's certain things that really matter. So one thing I would say to all of you, involve patients at the earliest stage of the development of the technology. Not on the blue sky sort of technological development, but the time when you're thinking about clinical translation. It is rewarding, and it is so important that the patient is involved at that stage. And they will come up with ideas, as we know with the liver, with the person that Matt's talking to. It's had a big impact. So with insight, I've now almost finished, even though I'm 4 minutes over, aren't I? You're okay. Start off, discovery versus invention. I think that's quite important. I know there's lots of times we talked about hypothesis-led research and so on. That's much more about discovery. I think invention, and I think what a lot of us are doing is inventing things rather than discovering things. There's always an aspect of discovery in it, but it's the invention. And I think invention is it's a creative process. It's almost like an art form. I think there's as much creativity in inventing something as there is in painting a painting or composing a new song. But we need to know whether we're in discovery or invention. The relative role of industry versus academia, that's bothered me all the way through my career. How much do we get industry to lead on something, and how much is it led in academia? But actually it's a collaboration between the two. And I've tried to show how that's worked. And often it doesn't work, but you've got to at least try and make that happen. And of course the regulatory compliance is important. And I just put this in now because I think I started my career at the beginning of CT and MRI and have seen revolutions happen in those technologies. What you have now, you have in the last 10 years, is the revolution of AI. I mean, I think it's so exciting. I wish I was starting again so I could get involved in some of this. But this balance between industry and academia is getting tough, I think, because some of the industrial players have become so powerful. But I do firmly believe there's that role of academia in being, truthful, honest, publicizing and publishing what you do, and having academic integrity. I think it's so important to have that as we go through that revolution. Anyway, we could talk about that. That's a topic for drinks later. Large lab versus small. I finished up with a large lab. I'll tell a quick story if I can, and this concerns Dave Delpy. Dave Delpy, there's actually been a couple of times I've tried to get a job at UCL, and there was an interview. I was about halfway through my time at Guy's. I can't remember precisely when it was. And I trundled over, and I can remember, I don't know who asked it might have been David. He said, I then had a group of about 6, 7 people over at Guy's. And they said, what's your ambition, David? I mean, if you move you over here, how big do you want your lab to be? And I said, 10, certainly no more than 12. And I think I was still right there. I didn't get the job, by the way. Whether that was the reason I didn't get the job, I don't know. But There was a paper published a few years ago, and I think I've remembered this right. The optimal size of a group to get a Nobel Prize is 5. If you make it too big, you're not going to get your Nobel Prize. With a large lab, you split up into, each PI will have 5 to 10 people that they look after. So it has to stay manageable. But with a large group, you are able to cross-fertilize ideas and expertise in an important way. And we've got numerous examples where that worked in CIMIC and I think is now working in the Combined Institute. Linked to that is academic independence. How can you possibly be judged as being independent? It's your ideas that you're developing when you're part of such a large lab. And that's linked to competition versus cooperation. And something I've felt very strongly over my years is how important it is to cooperate and to be open about ideas. There will be a time when it comes to competition, you want to identify something as being yours and you're going to be the first or the lead author on a publication so you can claim it. But in general, cooperation and openness makes sense. What does multidisciplinary really mean? And again, lots of examples. Not much work is truly multidisciplinary. We like to think that we work in a multidisciplinary area, but often it is us as the engineers and the physicists who want to go to the doctors, the medics, and say, can you give us 100 or 1,000 x-rays of this? We just see them as sources of data, and we're not really contributing anything back. Conversely, a group in doing some medical research just want some techies who can sort of crunch the numbers or fix their computers. True multidisciplinary work is where you can get both contributing and both coming up with original ideas that can be checked and tested. And I think I've shown some of those examples. What had real impact? Image registration methods, I think we did have an impact on that. The prostate cancer story, I think, though our part in that, I think was very small. It was mainly what was going on with the imaging people and with the urologists. The Vision RT, we had a tiny input right at the beginning, but it had tremendous impact in the long term. And I think there are others, but I won't go into them now. Anyway, last slide. I've picked up my guitar again. So this is me in the local pub in Totnes a couple of years ago. And if you want, I'm going to be playing guitar again over the weekend with friends down in Hampshire. There is a free festival in a tiny village called Curdridge that nobody has ever heard of that we'll be playing at in 2 weeks' time. So there you are. That's me sailing in the rain. We've actually sold our boat, sadly, but I'm still intending to spend a lot of time on the water in our lovely part of the world. When not on the water, we don't have any public transport where we are, so we have a community transport organisation which I help look after, and I drive a bus. I've retrained. I had to go and do a bus test to drive that bus, and it's such fun. Well, it's fun driving the bus anyway, but it's also fun from a community point of view. You understand how isolated some people are in a rural community. This is interesting. I mentioned this to Danny Alexander. There's an organisation called Friends of the Dart. Are they actually? Yeah, there they are. This is our River Dart. It's a beautiful river. I think it's the most beautiful river on the planet, but it is heavily polluted at times with sewage that comes in from us, all these different villages and towns, runs off from the fields. And so this organisation is a community interest company, which I'm associated with. We sample water, all the way along the river. We chase where there might be pollution. We collect vast amounts of data. We also have data on how much it rains. We have data from the Environment Agency. We have data from, when we can get hold of it, from South West Water. And I think there's an interesting big data problem, nothing to do with medical physics, but all to do with data analysis. And I think we're thinking of ways we can put together a model of the whole river and its catchment area. And I think that is feasible now with the technology we have, and that's going to be an interesting project. Most of all, I enjoy doing this. I don't do it very often, but I enjoy it when I do. And that is getting down to the younger generation. So my daughters, my grandchildren, actually it was my daughter who got me involved with the school teacher here at Thames Titton for their science festival. And we had great fun. I concocted an image-guided surgery on bananas, practical. I had no idea bananas were so interesting. That's an MR scanner of a banana. There's a CT scan. X-rays are a bit boring. And so we had to find these structures. So all the kids had a banana and they had a knife, and it was great fun. It was just so messy. We destroyed 60 bananas over a morning. Anyway, that's it. Thank you so much, and acknowledge all these people and many who aren't on there for supporting the work over so many years. It's been great fun, and thank you for your time and patience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. That really was a thoroughly enjoyable talk. If I can just ask you to stay here just for a few minutes. So, good evening, everyone. I am Peter Munro, Head of Department for Medical Physics and Biomedical Engineering. I know many of you know that, but for those of you that don't, yes, but thank you so much for coming to this wonderful event. I personally have thoroughly enjoyed both talks, and I'm sure that you will say the same. I'd like particularly to thank Dave, Lizzie, Jem Hebden, Robert Speller, and the Clifton family for being here and making today really special. So at UCL, one of the ways that the main way that we describe our most distinguished professors, of which Dave is one, is that they have contributed to a paradigm shift. I think in this case, we can say not so much a shift, but establishing a paradigm, which is really something to be proud of. And it makes me think, just going back to your connection with Brian May, because as I know that you'll know, Brian May went on to finish his PhD. Yep. So the question is, I know we've seen that you're continuing on with your music career, but will you be as big as Brian May was in music in a few years' time? I think, yes, I think all I can say is I think Brian May is a much better physicist than I am a rock musician. Well, maybe not. We'll see. But what I did want to do is just perhaps link a little bit the benefit of the funding that's provided by the Clifton family, because a lot of what Dave has spoken about is really helping, I think, our many, well, not just early career researchers, but even some more senior researchers, really give some inspiration and some ideas about how to go about developing their career. And the Clifton Fellowship gives early career researchers an opportunity to establish their career. And actually, even the applicants who are unsuccessful, and we have some very good unsuccessful applications, just going through that process is really helpful for them. Okay, so I wanted just to reflect a few key points, and you can tell me if I've got it wrong, Dave. But I think things can take time to have impact. Academics need to be adaptable and flexible in their career path. I mean, you showed us you were prepared to go to various places to work as opportunities arose, and also what you work on. And nurturing the big idea, I think, is really important. This week I've been working on a slide that highlights achievements of the department. I've got a blank spot for Nobel Prize. So I'm hoping that we all take this on as a sort of a charge to get working on that. But you need to be able to work effectively with a wide spectrum of people. I think that came out of your talk. And you reinforced a number of times the importance of trying to get your work out there, be it a clinic or commercialized or open source software. But I think perhaps most importantly, you need to have passion, which you still clearly have in abundance. I can guarantee if you do apply for a job with us again, you will get it. We will follow correct processes, but you will get the job. And so I think that gives everyone a lot of advice. I would like to say that I know, well, please don't overwhelm Dave, but if you've not been in touch with Dave and you think that he can give you a bit of advice, I'm sure he'd be happy to help. So please do take that as an opportunity. So that means that there are only two things left to do. The first thing is to present Dave with this Joel Lecture Medal. So congratulations, Dave, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Bye.